Welcome back. This is the ESOP Guy. We are on a journey to an ESOP. So for those that are tuning in for the very first time, this podcast is really about helping folks to understand what an employee stock ownership plan is, how would it apply to their business. And in a lot of different ways, there's a lot of things to talk about for ESOPs. And so what we do for the podcast is really just do topics and different things that I think are helpful for individuals to listen to or really look at to determine, is it the right thing for them? So that's what this podcast is all about. If you have an interest in other episodes, please go to our website at journeytoanesop.com. And so with all of that, I wanted to say thanks for tuning in today. We have the opportunity today to explore even deeper. One of the questions that we've had recently is how do ESOPs apply to different types of industries and what types of industries? So one of the ones that we're going to cover today is the healthcare industry. And to do that, I'm going to have the privilege of interviewing both Steve James and Heather Driscoll. And they are representing SJC or SCJ.
SCJ.
I screwed up your name. SCJ
right.
Trustee. And so they're going to be helping me really kind of go through this whole topic of healthcare. How does an ESOP work for the healthcare industry, with a lot of different experience that they have in sharing, and how that really looks for companies that are thinking, if that's your industry, great. This is going to be a great podcast for you today. So with that, I just want to say again, thank you guys for joining today. I'm really excited to have you on the podcast, and I wanted to kind of start off with just an overview. Give us a little bit of a background on how you guys got into the ESOPs in the first place. And I guess we could start with you, Steve, if you want to.
Yeah. Good morning, Phil. And thank you for the opportunity to speak on ESOPs and specifically our journey of SCJ Fiduciary Services, in particular mine. SCJ Fiduciary Services is actually just my initials, which is Stephen C. James. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a recovering CFO, CPA, 35-year CPA. But what in my journey of serving with small businesses, about 25 years ago, was introduced to a small dental practice that had aspirations of becoming a group. That small dental practice was called Mortensen Family Dental. It was founded by Dr. Owain Mortensen. And I had the privilege of being part of that group at its infancy of growth. A couple years into my role as the CFO and COO of the company, I had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Morton about succession planning. And while I didn't know much about it, I'd had some past experience with benefit plans and even the concept of an ESOP, but certainly had never done one. But with Dr. Mortensen's permission, we went on a journey that took us 2 years, which we now believe to be the formation of the first dental group ESOP in America. And I happened to serve as the trustee for that transaction. And of course, in those days, you could use internally trusteed individuals. And I happened to be the person that drew the short straw that did that. So that was my introduction to ESOPs, and much less being a trustee. But well, I'll let my colleague Heather Driscoll talk about it a little bit. That was really the foundation of how I fell in love with employee ownership, what it did specifically for me as a employee participant, much less what it meant to the organizations and my colleagues at Mortensen. So much so that as the trustee, I decided that I really wanted to understand what it meant to be a fiduciary, to act with prudence and judgment. And after a few years of serving as the trustee for Mortensen, I realized that by then, as a director, an officer, an employee, as well as the trustee that I was, and a shareholder, I was more than a little bit conflicted. So I was instrumental in helping appoint the first independent trustee for Mortensen, but that caught the attention of some local attorneys here in my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, and with I guess the urgings of some local attorneys as well as Mortensen's founder, I started doing some limited trustee work some 13 years ago in 2008, and was really just a bit of a sidelight. I mean, my aspirations were to work for Mortenson for the rest of my career, but because of some things that I'm sure you've talked about it on this podcast, Phil, with the process settlement agreements and the Department of Labor entering into agreements with some trustees, the landscape of how professional services were offered in ESOP transactions, specifically trustee services, really changed about 6 or 8 years ago. And in my case, that meant for me as a part-time trustee, having an opportunity to build a business. And because of a number of things, including my colleague Heather Driscoll here on the line, I had the beginnings of a business. And with Heather's direction and inspiration, we built something that actually forced me to make the difficult decision of leaving my role at Mortenson, which by then had become a very, very large dental group, some 2,000 employees, and an ESOP that was had probably 60 to 80 million dollars worth of assets. So very, very successful. But the draw to be a individual trustee and serving a trustee team, much less the clients that we have across the country, was quite compelling. And so about 3 years ago, I left Mortenson and started SCJ Fiduciary Services, as it's now known.
Great.
So Heather, maybe perhaps you could introduce yourself.
Sure. And again, thank you, Phil, for allowing us to be here today. Always fun to talk about ESOPs, specifically in the healthcare space. So as Steve shared, my name is Heather Driscoll, and I've been a member of Steve's trustee team for a little more than 4 years now. But our path actually crossed through dentistry. So I started out in dentistry probably about 20 years ago, really from an operations standpoint, just helping to lead and guide a single dental practice that I worked with. But it ultimately merged with Mortenson Dental Partners as part of their growth strategy. And with that merger, really became an opportunity for me to become an employee owner first and foremost, but also really a leader of that organization. So I had the great privilege of leading the operations team for the company for a good number of years. And one of my responsibilities was to help all of our employee owners understand what that meant. What are the benefits of employee ownership? And how does that translate into exceptional patient care? Really, how does the day-to-day decision-making process and our commitment to our core values and exceptional patient care ultimately impact the wealth that people are able to build for themselves through their ESOP accounts? So it's been a really fun journey. My heart is certainly in healthcare. Love the opportunity really to be able to see employee ownership and healthcare come together more prominently, which we've seen in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And thanks for your background on that. I was thinking about when Steve was talking about doing it the very first time, how being a dental practice, and nobody was thinking about hey, this is a strategy. I think that probably took a lot of vision and guts, because now how do you deal with certain challenges that the Department of Labor is going to look at? And nobody's got a precedent on the valuation, for instance. And so somebody's going to have to be able to kind of bite off I would say, the unknowns. And so as you guys, I know that was, you're doing, Steve, but as you look at that, what was going in your mind as you went through the whole ESOP process? And I know it was different back then than it is now, because it was probably a little easier in some ways than an ESOP transaction now.
Yeah, I think it's quite honestly, it was quite a bit easier in terms of formation. And I don't think that the right, wrong, or indifferent, the level of presence or concern or the optics of a transaction were certainly not as front and center as they are today, much less the fact that while I think we had great intentions in terms of creating the employee trust and creating a benefit to the employees, I don't think we looked at it those days in terms of an arm's length transaction like it's expected to be today. Certainly, valuation was a significant issue back then, as it is today for any healthcare related businesses, much less closely held businesses is making sure that you have a proper assessment of value, but also good comps if you can find those. And quite honestly, in the healthcare space, especially the dental space at the time, and even to some degree now, they're hard to find. And so determining what was a fair value was a lot of the concern. Interestingly enough, a topic that I became quite familiar with over the years, but didn't really understand at the time was, how does a professional service organization such as Mortensen, how does it become have a non-dentist, or for that matter, any healthcare professional owner? In our case, we went a very, very unique path which I wouldn't necessarily advise people to consider. And that's actually, we went to the state attorney general's office in the state of Kentucky to determine if the practice of dentistry and the ownership of a dental practice were the same. In our case, we were able to get a favorable ruling from the state attorney general's office that said they were not. That is a very difficult process. It took us a long time to be able to secure that opinion. And we were only in one state at the time. Now Mortensen now is in 10 or 11 states, and that methodology simply doesn't work, much less large dental groups or even any type of healthcare groups. You're going to have professional service acts of each individual state that you're going to have to comply with. So what is commonly applied as a methodology is setting up a management service organization or an MSO or a DSO, as they call them. And those entities, then they provide the services to the regulated entity of a dental practice or a veterinarian practice or a physician's group or whatever that might be.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit deeper, because I think that's a really big issue when it comes to thinking about these types of healthcare industry. So let me go back to it. So when Heather's story was about the her role in operations, your company was already an ESOP company, or you helped them through that process?
No, Mortensen was actually already an existing.
Oh, that's right. You worked for Mortensen. Got it.
Yep, I did for a good number of years. And they were probably an ESOP for maybe 6 or 7 years or so when I joined. But interestingly enough, what was unique to them is not really, it felt unique, I guess, to me at the time, is really a common challenge with employee-owned companies all across the board. And what I found was that there was probably a good amount of excitement and focus put on the ESOP right at its inception, right? In the first couple of years, lots of attention and excitement. The challenge really was when I entered the picture, the ESOP had kind of taken a back seat. There wasn't as much focus or education around the ESOP, even though the company was growing really rapidly. What I noticed was that it was really just probably the first 100 people or so, maybe a bit more than that, who really had the benefit of fully understanding what it was and why it was important, and really what an incredible opportunity it was for them as individuals. So one of my responsibilities really was just the ongoing education. Also the, kind of the balancing of helping people understand really how value is derived, to your point earlier about the valuation. Well, how do you translate that information down to, frontline operations in a dental practice or in any company for that matter? But the ESOP was certainly in place, and my responsibility was really just helping people to get to know it, understand it, and hopefully make it a part of their day-to-day decision making, and really a part of the culture as opposed to an event once a year.
Nice. Looks like Steve might have jumped off. So
we lost Steve for a second there.
He'll come back on. Okay, that's really good. So that kind of sets us up a little bit to talk about, when we think about the dental practices, clearly that's a healthcare company. What are some other healthcare organizations that you would say would be qualified for an ESOP? Sure.
So we've actually had the great privilege of helping a few healthcare entities become employee owned. So probably most recently was psychiatric clinics. So a mental health arm of healthcare. We've actually also worked with some autism centers. So really kind of a niche market there as far as healthcare goes. But we've also had the great privilege of being introduced to, veterinary clinics who are becoming employee-owned, physical therapy groups, eye centers, optometry. Gosh, the list probably goes on and on. I might be forgetting a few people, but it really has kind of started to make its mark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Heather, while ESOPs and healthcare organizations, interestingly enough, I'm not always quite sure why this is, Phil, you probably could tell us, but engineering and architectural firms have been ESOPs for as long as I can remember.
Sure.
And they're professional service organizations, but other healthcare organizations that are structured a lot like an engineering and architectural firm in some respects in terms of how they're regulated by the state. But I think ESOPs and healthcare companies, as Heather described, they honestly are uniquely they're uniquely fitted to an ESOP because of certain things. I don't know if you'd want to talk about that a bit, Heather, because of the nature of what people do or the cultures or whatever that might be.
Well, I think for so long, healthcare specifically has reserved ownership for the professional themselves, and so that made sense. It makes sense in some situations, but the fact of the matter is, in all of the healthcare businesses that I've had the great privilege of working with, the people, the teams are really the asset. It's a bit different, from like a traditional manufacturing company or something like that, where there's inventory and equipment and all of those kinds of things. The people really are what drive revenue and experience and ultimately value in an organization. So with the ability to create management services, organizations, dental service organizations, whatever it might be, allowing for ownership outside of the regulated professional entity really has opened the door, I think, from a recruiting standpoint, a retention standpoint. One of the things that I think is really important in healthcare is just the consistency of people, with consistency of providers and consistency of team members. Really typically comes consistency and retention of patients. Mm-hmm. And so having that ability to create a space where not only people want to come and stay from a cultural standpoint, but from a financial standpoint, there's been some really great benefit there.
No, I think it's really interesting, and I don't think it's the first thing on people's minds when they think about an ESOP company, as far as the healthcare part of it. And I like the idea of why would it be a good fit. So if you think about it, like the psychiatric office, the autism center, the physical therapy, or the vet center, what were their options? And this is partly what I do in talking to a new company that's thinking about some type of exit. What were their options if it wasn't an ESOP?
Yeah. So quite honestly, all those fields, much less dentistry, interestingly enough, they are good business models. I would tell you strategic buyers, but in particular, private equity has become a significant buyer in the space. Multiples are quite high. As Heather suggested, a well-run dental practice, which we know quite well, and we know psychiatric practice well run. So margins are quite honestly above most normal business margins. The challenge is that they're highly dependent on people, more so than probably most businesses. I mean, in our business in Mortensen, 85% of the operating costs were people. Mm-hmm. And then you had people that were licensed, which I think dissuade some people. But interestingly enough, it doesn't, Wall Street's still very interested in it. While there are no publicly traded dental practice, I think there will be here probably within the next year again. But I think that's probably, as much as anything else, why it hasn't been as prominent in recent memory as it probably should be. What we're seeing now, in particular with healthcare companies, is while they know they could sell to a strategic buyer or private equity, a lot of these businesses, they want something else.
Mm.
And they've never been introduced to a concept of ESOP. I would tell you that most CPAs, attorneys, if they know anything about ESOPs at all, they would tell you that it would be very difficult to put together because of the regulated nature of the industry. And I'm here to tell you that's not true.
Yeah.
But it does take some work.
Yeah.
And it does take some expertise to be able to design the structure.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be done and has been done,
Yeah.
even at the very highest level of organizations.
And that's what this podcast is all about, because I think there's so many misconceptions with ESOPs in general, but to kind of look at the focus of what we're doing today, that's really helpful. And so we're gonna get into that a little bit more deep, in terms of people really understand when we're talking about the company itself can't just sell to an ESOP. They have to set up these management service organizations because of the licensing, or can you explain that part of the challenge?
I would say that more often than not, that's the case. In Mortenson's case, we didn't have to do it. We actually did a dental practice that was based in Ohio. That's 100% dental ESOP. In fact, we think it's the first 100% dental ESOP in America. But in Ohio, the nature of the Dental Practice Act allows for non-dentist own that entity. So in this case here, an ESOP being a non-dentist could do it. That's a bit of an anomaly.
Right.
I would tell you in most states that doesn't exist. Certainly in your state of Florida, you would have to set up a management service organization to make it work. So I think when in doubt, just setting up that structure probably makes the most sense.
Okay.
And then you need to set up a management service agreement that's compliant with the states that you're doing business in, and that's true whether it's a physician group, veterinarian group, psychiatric. That's a common theme.
Yeah, the service agreement. So let me kind of walk that out a little bit more, just step by step. So when you set up the management service organization pre-ESOP, we haven't sold the company to an ESOP.
Right.
I've got my shares in a healthcare company. Maybe I'm an S corp already. I've got stock in that S corp, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer that stock into the management service organization prior to the transaction. Is that what's happening?
It depends. You could do it that way.
Okay.
And in the case of Mortenson, what we did is we converted from a PSC to an incorporated entity, which allowed us to set up a management service organization. It was an easier structure. To your point, Phil, what I see most often is the licensed dental practice enters into agreement with a new entity, a holdco, I'll call it, a holding company, that has a management service agreement in it. And usually the common shareholders of the dental practice, which are going to be licensed dentists or licensed physicians or whatever it might be, they're going to become identical shareholders of that holdco, which has the management service agreement. And that's usually what we see happen.
Okay, got it. So that's not that complicated, really, when you think.
No, it's not. I think the complicated thing in these type of structures is, and this is probably where you do need an attorney that really does understand the practice of whatever that healthcare profession is in terms of how it is regulated from state to state. That's probably the uniqueness, and there's not a lot of law firms, I would tell you, across the country that have that expertise. We know them, but certainly that's important. But making sure that management service agreement complies with the laws of those respective states, or even multiple states, much less making sure that who is employed and where they are employed is legal as well. And I guess specifically, I could speak to dentists, is in some states, the dentist cannot be employed by a management service organization. They have to be employed by the dental practice. And so you just have to work through all those details.
So if I have a company that has offices in 5 different states, with 5 different state laws, who do I have to comply with?
What typically we see happen, and Heather, I know Heather actually owns dental practices still, so she could probably speak to this probably even more informed manner. But what my experience has been is you take the most rigorous state and you build the MSO to comply with the most rigorous state. What would you add to that, Heather?
No, that's exactly what I would add. And interestingly enough, specifically in these professional service organizations, MSOs and management services agreements aren't all that unique. They're becoming more prominent, really, even just outside of ESOPs. When you think about even, let's just say, a physician who wants to ensure that their spouse can continue to own the business if something were to happen to them, or the people that work within their organization, whether or not they're wanting to become an ESOP, really creating opportunity for executives who are non-licensed in their profession, or certainly dentistry's closest to our heart, but a dental hygienist, whatever it might be. So the actual thought process or structure of the management services agreement has really honestly been around probably longer than it's been getting attention, because it's served multiple purposes. It just so happens it works really well from an ESOP standpoint too.
Yeah. No, interesting. So it's got other benefits too. If you have, if you're not even going to do an ESOP, it might be just better for the organization to have that.
Right.
Yes, I think it very much is.
Yeah. I was like, so I'm not a CPA. I remember becoming a partner and an owner of this business, and we had to change our name because that law was, if you have any non-CPA owners, you have to be, now we're Berman Hopkins CPAs and Associates. So I always tell people, I didn't get my name in the title or the firm. I'm just the and Associates guy. So anyway, so with other things, other regulations, and again, I think, partly it may be a lot more easy than people really understand. So other things that are problematic or challenges to take this type of organization and move them into, whether it's 100% ESOP or even talking about a partial ESOP, are you seeing kind of that being pretty straightforward, or are there other challenges we need to deal with?
Well, I think that certainly the structure is probably the first thing you have to deal with. I think once you get past the structure issue, and as Heather suggested, that's pretty common for any large group structure that's multi-state. So that's not, reinventing the wheel, so to speak. Where I think that has probably been a bit of a concern, especially as the valuation multiples been so high, especially in dentistry, veterinarian, physical therapy, autism centers. All those multiples have been extremely high because of private equity, largely. And I think a lot of people have viewed it as, how am I going to be able to compete as an ESOP buyer with that data, given the fact that none of those entities, none of those businesses, or at least certainly most of them, there's no guideline or market comps to draw from, because there's not really publicly traded companies in those spaces. More recently, because there's been such a prominence of private equity and strategic buyers, there are law firms that specialize in these type of transactions. And we think that we can secure market data that will allow us to be competitive. I don't want to say that we would beat a strategic buyer or private equity, but it would allow that to be more indicative of what market comps are. And when you're looking at evaluation of an ESOP as a potential buyer, for that matter, any buyer, you're really going to use a multitude of different valuation methodologies. One of which would be, the historical performance. Another one would be the future performance, but also market data is crucial. And historically, one of the bigger challenges that we had as part of Mortensen for the early years was there wasn't a lot of market data to draw from. So we were really valuing it based on our own performance, not necessarily comparing it to other like businesses. And I think we're starting to see some of that data trickle out, which I think will help an ESOP be potentially a competitive buyer. And then you couple it with some of the advantages that ESOPs have. I'm sure you've talked on some of your other podcasts, the tax-free exchange through Code Section 1042, which an ESOP can do. That's worth, maybe perhaps a turn or two of EBITDA, that suddenly you're finding that an ESOP buyer in a professional service organization, healthcare organization, might be in the range. I don't want to ever suggest that they're going to beat a PE, a strategic buyer, but you might be a lot closer than historically most people think you have been. And I think that's been a common I think that's been a bit of an obstacle for an ESOP to be a buyer of a physician group of anything.
One additional challenge that I think people really have to take into consideration is the organizations, specifically government regulated entities that are reimbursers of their services. So for instance, if you have any kind of contract with Medicaid, Medicare, some of those kinds of things, it's not that you can't make it happen. It's just, I think those are things you have to be aware of going in, that sometimes there's a requirement for their contract or their contracted reimbursements that might look a little bit different for someone who's a non-professional owner. And so I think you just have to take into consideration the potential, we always call it re-credentialing or really the potential for a lag in your revenue stream while you're kind of working through that change of ownership. So that's probably the only other thing that I can think of. When you ask the question about what are some of the other potential challenges, not obstacles necessarily, but maybe a little bit more challenging.
That's a great point. Yeah. Cause obviously the cash flow is everything. And if you don't have the Medicare reimbursement, somehow it gets jeopardized with the change up, and then you could totally ruin the whole thing. Right. So how do you just have to review the contracts, and then how do you guys get through that issue just to make sure you're not jeopardizing that with a management service organization?
Really, it's just diligence, right? I can't think of any time that we haven't been able to work past it. It's really probably more than anything paperwork, right? It's really truly the kind of proactive, hey, here's what our plan is, here's what this is going to look like, what's that going to require from your side of things. It's probably not a whole lot different than if you were transitioning ownership from one licensed professional to another. It's just something that I think isn't always thought about ahead of time. And so then, when it takes a little bit longer than probably most people anticipate, and there's a potential strain on cash flow, if that is a big source of revenue, always better to be a bit more prepared for that as opposed to kind of panicking and reacting after the fact. So
I would agree with that, Heather. I think that's one of the things that it is just probably emphasizes the importance of, if you're selling your business, to get good representation, whether it's a CPA, an attorney, an investment banker, sell-side advisor of any sort. It's really just having them help you through the journey of understanding how you go about selling and what the risks are and how you prevent those risks. I think we haven't encountered a situation that you couldn't overcome, as Heather suggested with those. But I do think that with proper representation, hopefully they'll uncover those type of things before they become an issue. What you don't want to do is do a change of control transaction where you violated your agreement and somehow you've stopped a revenue stream for a period of time that could be, as you suggested, Phil, disruptive to your cash flow. Fortunately, we haven't encountered that just yet, but we've certainly encountered through due diligence situations like that, where we've actually put a pause on a transaction to make sure that whomever that might be, and that's not limited obviously to healthcare or professional services. It could be you have a
government contract,
change of control issue.
Exactly.
I think those are good for people to think about, because it really should be probably identified early in the feasibility process. Review your contracts, whether it's in healthcare or not, review the contracts and see if there's any problems in your cash flow that need to be identified. Is there any issue with a partial? Do you see first off, do you see partial ESOPs as healthcare? And are there any?
Actually, you see them most often, quite honestly.
Okay.
You do. I think that will probably change. But the Mortensen ESOP we did, that started as a 40% ESOP. It's actually probably hovering between 30 and 40% this day. as I suggested, the one we did in Ohio, to our knowledge, was the first 100% dental group ESOP. I think the professional service marketplace, but especially medical, is still kind of a bit of a cottage industry. And I think there's a thought that the physicians want to own some level of the entity. I would tell you, with a lot of things going on, certainly growing student debt, that's not really as much of an option today as it was a decade ago. So, healthcare employers are having to adapt, but we've rarely seen in the healthcare space control ESOPs.
Really? Okay.
Yep.
Is there a staged plan that they're coming into? Like, hey, we'll do a tranche here, and is it like a 10-year plan, or is it just we're going to do a partial, take the benefit, and then we want to keep that one part of the ownership private or just for direct ownership?
I think it's a couple things, but Heather, you probably could speak to this in a more informed manner. I think it's kind of the beginning of a succession plan for an individual. Most of the large healthcare groups that I know of have a number of owners, a number of providers. And so you're really trying to create a succession strategy for those individuals. The ESOP, can be a buyer of those folks. So it is kind of the beginning of an exit strategy, because there's a independent valuation that's conducted every year. They have some level of knowledge of what that's going to look like. In our case in Mortensen, even though we were a minority ESOP, the ESOP was the primary buyer of all the retirees. So we rolled up a lot of dental groups over about a 10-year period because they aspired to continue to work, but they wanted to have the confidence that when they were ready to retire, they'd have a definitive exit strategy and a fair price for their business. And I think that's probably interesting enough. Healthcare businesses that are the most important asset is the provider of care. Mm-hmm. It's the license there, and similar to a typical organization that's manufacturing and construction or whatever it is. It's the leadership team that, to me, one of the things when we look at valuations is we're always looking at succession planning and looking at leadership development in terms of the continuity of value to protect the employee ownership. In the case of a healthcare company, what you really want is to see that there is a continuity of providers. And quite honestly, you're always concerned about a concentration of a provider having too much of the goodwill in the patient relationship. So I think an ESOP hopefully can create an environment where you can recruit those young healthcare physicians that perhaps can't buy in. And I think that's a real big challenge in the space. Mm-hmm. Whether it's dentistry or veterinary or psychiatric or whatever it is, I think it's common now.
Yeah, for sure.
Plus, you layer on the opportunity for things like synthetic equity, like SARS programs and things like that.
I was gonna ask you about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have a whole nother really strategy for the crossover between performance and reward and retention and all of the challenges that any business faces. So
yeah. So you can really reward the ones that aren't buying in, but become ESOP holders with an incentive plan, like a stock appreciation rights program, or
absolutely.
Yeah. So I think those are, again, kind of comes back to normal ESOPs too, and how exactly. You consider this business is just a normal business. So kind of, we're almost out of time. I guess I would just say, first off, just as we think about what we just talked about, I know we covered a lot of ground. We don't always have a ton of time to get into all the nuances. I mean, we just kind of pull this back and say, hey, let's look at this a little bit. Would there be anything that you want to kind of add to what you said, that for people that are thinking about, they're in a healthcare business, that in terms of how they should go forward or thinking about this as a possibility?
Probably the only thing I would say, and I don't think it's limited to healthcare, but I think that ESOPs are really a very wonderful way to perpetuate culture and legacy. And I think specifically in healthcare, because the business is a patient experience, legacy and culture really are a value driver. And so an ESOP is a really fantastic way to be to be able to perpetuate that for generations to come. And I think it just marries really nicely with why people get into healthcare in the first place. You know, they're typically caregivers. They're really wanting to take care of people. And so we've just found that it's making good sense for a lot of people from an exit strategy standpoint. So Steve, I don't know what you would add.
Great point.
Heather, you said, I couldn't have said it better. I think that to me, it just resonates so loudly that, legacy is a common theme. Legacy of culture, legacy of value is a common thing of all ESOP companies that we work with. Certainly all the formations, we see that every day. But healthcare is, as Heather suggested, it's a much more intimate relationship. These are individuals that these providers are developing it, and the desire to have legacy of care is so crucial.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that a healthcare provider, probably more than most businesses, that the difficult to be able to walk away from the business, even though it might be a better decision to sell to a strategic buyer or private equity.
Yeah.
Financially, it might be a better decision. But I think there is a fear that the care that these families that have been trusted these healthcare providers to serve their families and generations of families is so intimate that I think that I think an ESOP can perpetuate that, because the organizations, the values, the structures probably potentially could continue more likely in that structure.
It's a good point. Well, again, I mean, we could talk probably for a long time about the topic. We don't have that, but I wanted to thank you guys for your experience. I mean, to do the very first dental practice in the country as an ESOP, I think is very admirable and really very cool. I mean, to pioneer something like that, and to look at this topic, to be honest with you, I haven't really looked at it as much, because it's not come across my table or my desk as much. So I think it's really good for people to be thinking about it. And hopefully what we've done today is just give people a better idea about, hey, this could be another viable option for you, to think about it. So I really appreciate it. And it is SCJ Fiduciary Services. So sorry, I kind of messed that up at the beginning, but you guys are awesome. So with that, thank you so much for being here today. We'll look forward to our next podcast and the new topics that we have coming in season 3, and just wish everybody a great day. And thank you for listening today.
Thank you, Phil.
Bye.